My name is Sienna Barber, and at 29 years old, as a major in the United States Navy, I've learned that respect isn't given. It's earned. But on my wedding day, standing in a historic chapel in Charleston, my own father decided to strip it all away. As I walked down the aisle in my service dress white uniform, I heard him whisper to my brother, just loud enough for me to hear, "Look at her. It's like she's playing dress up for Halloween. So disgraceful." My throat closed up and it felt like 1,000 shards of glass were scraping against the inside of my chest. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night in a combat operations center, every time I'd faced down danger. It was all reduced to a single, contemptuous phrase. My brother Daniel let out a smirk, that cold, familiar sound that had followed me through childhood every time I failed to please them. They had no idea I was prepared for this moment. They thought this was their show, but this stage was mine. And the play was just beginning. Let me know where you're listening from in the comments. Hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had the people who are supposed to love you most use their words as weapons to make you feel small and worthless. I stood behind the heavy oak doors of St. Michael's Chapel in Charleston. It was a place steeped in history, a landmark of the American spirit. Late afternoon sun filtered through the stained glass windows, painting the stone floor in brilliant streaks of sapphire and ruby. The air smelled of old wood, lemon polish, and the sweet, heavy perfume of the white lilies lining the aisle. This was supposed to be a moment of peace, of sacred promise. But my heart was hammering against my ribs like a battle drum. I wasn't wearing a wedding gown. My attire was my service dress whites, the crisp, immaculate uniform of my commission. The golden oak leaf insignia of a major shone on each collar point. This wasn't an impulsive choice, it was a declaration. It was the truth of who I was. I knew that in the front pew, my father, Richard Barber, wasn't sitting as a father. He was sitting as a judge. For my entire life, he had presided over the court of my existence, and the verdict was always the same: guilty of not being my brother. Today, he was waiting for this rebellion, as he called it, to become the punchline of a joke he could tell his business partners. He was waiting for me to fail. Then the old doors groaned open. The first powerful notes from the pipe organ swelled and filled the nave, silencing the low murmur of the guests. I took my first step. Every eye turned to me. A wave of stunned silence washed over the room. I could feel their surprise, their curiosity. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The tight, condescending smirk on my father's face. I kept my chin up, my gaze fixed on the altar where my fiancé, Mark, was waiting. As I drew level with the front pew, my father leaned toward my brother, Daniel. He didn't raise his voice, but in the cavernous silence of the chapel, his words cut through the air like a razor. It was a low, venomous hiss. "Look at her," he breathed, the sound thick with disdain. "It's like she's playing dress up for Halloween. So disgraceful." Daniel let out a quiet snort. It was a small sound, barely a puff of air, but to me, it echoed like a gunshot. My chest seized. The air vanished from my lungs, stolen in an instant. The world blurred at the edges, the beautiful colors of the stained glass bleeding into a meaningless smear. All that remained was his voice, his words. They weren't just words, they were poison darts, and they found their mark in the deepest, most vulnerable part of me. The phrase began to spin in my mind, drilling deeper with every turn. Disgraceful. Halloween. Disgraceful. I thought I was ready for it. In the weeks leading up to this day, I'd built walls around my heart, steeling myself for their inevitable disapproval. I'd repeated mantras to myself, affirmations of my own worth, my own strength. I'd told myself their words were just noise, the meaningless static of men who could never understand my world. But hearing it, right here, right now, felt like a fresh burn being pressed onto an old, raw scar. I felt a hot flush creep up my neck and spread across my cheeks. My first instinct was to stop, to turn, to confront him right there in front of his powerful friends. But I didn't. I'm a commanding officer. I have stood on the bridge of a destroyer in a storm, made life or death decisions in the dead of night, and looked true danger in the eye without flinching. I would not break in the face of my own father's petty cruelty. So I forced my head higher. I focused on Mark, his worried eyes searching mine from the end of the aisle. His gaze was my only lighthouse in the storm, a steady beam of love and acceptance in a sea of judgment. I tried to hold on to it, to let it pull me to safety. But even as I fixed my eyes on him, the echo of my father's words kept ricocheting inside my skull. Disgraceful. Disgraceful. Every step I took on that aisle, scattered with white rose petals, felt like I was treading on the shattered pieces of my own history. With each footfall, a memory splintered. I remembered every time my father had called my military achievements cute. Every time he'd waved away a story about one of my deployments to listen, captivated, as Daniel bragged about a stock deal. I remembered every holiday dinner where my service was treated as a strange, slightly embarrassing hobby, while Daniel's career in finance was celebrated as the family legacy. The whisper today wasn't a singular attack. It was the climax of a lifelong war, a quiet, brutal campaign against my spirit that he had waged since I was a little girl, who dared to choose a different path. A war in which, in his eyes, I was always the losing side. And so, as I finally reached the altar and took Mark's hand, my mind wasn't really there. The scent of the lilies, the solemn face of the minister, the weight of Mark's hand in mine. It all faded into the background. I had been pulled away, dragged back in time by the undertow of that single, venomous whisper. I was no longer in a sun-drenched chapel in Charleston. I was being pulled back to a cold Christmas night years ago, where this wound first began to bleed. It was Christmas, 3 years ago. The memory is sharp, cold, and clear, like a shard of ice in my mind. Our house in Greenwich, Connecticut was a perfect picture from a magazine. Every surface of the sprawling colonial was draped in tasteful, expensive decorations. A fire crackled merrily in the grand marble fireplace, casting a warm, dancing glow on the polished hardwood floors. The air was thick with the rich, comforting smells of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and my mother's famous pumpkin pie. It was a scene of perfect, manufactured holiday cheer. And as always, my father sat at the head of the long, formal dining table like a king on his throne. And my brother, Daniel, was the crown prince, the star of the evening. He was holding court, regaling my parents with a story about a multi-million-dollar deal he'd just closed. He spoke with the easy, unchecked arrogance of a man who had never known failure, his voice booming with self-satisfaction. My parents hung on his every word, their faces beaming with a pride so blatant it was almost blinding. I just sat there, nursing a glass of Cabernet, feeling utterly invisible. I had just returned home after a 6-month deployment in the Persian Gulf. It was a high-stakes intelligence mission, a relentless tour where every decision I made, every piece of intel I analyzed, could directly impact the lives of the men and women I served with. I had seen and done things that would keep most people up at night. But in this room, in this world of polished silver and talk of stock options, those experiences simply didn't exist. My reality was a foreign country they had no interest in visiting. Their world was Wall Street, exclusive parties at the country club, and yachting in the Hamptons. My world was classified briefings, the hum of a warship, and the weight of command. The two were universes apart. But a small, foolish part of me still hoped. Hope is a stubborn thing. It clings on long after it should have let go. So, I waited for a lull in the conversation, a brief pause in the worship of Daniel. When it came, I cleared my throat and took a breath, marshaling all my courage. "Dad," I said, my voice coming out softer, more hesitant than I'd intended. I was awarded the Navy Commendation Medal. The table fell silent. My father turned to look at me, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if I had just started speaking in a language he didn't understand. The proud smile he'd had for Daniel vanished, replaced by a cool, appraising stare. "Oh," he said finally, the single word dripping with indifference. "That's nice, dear. Good for you." He then immediately turned his attention back to Daniel, his face breaking into a broad, genuine smile once more. "Speaking of awards," he boomed, "Daniel won his golf tournament at the club last week. You should see the trophy. A real beauty. My brother leaned back in his chair, a smug smirk spreading across his face. It's just a plastic thing, Dad, he said, waving a dismissive hand. Probably not as pretty as Sienna's. Nice little ribbon. The table erupted in laughter. Not cruel laughter, but the easy, thoughtless laughter of people who were in on a joke I would never understand. And in that moment, the laughter felt more brutal than any shout. My medal. My Navy Commendation Medal. An honor that represented months of tireless work in a hostile environment. An honor that represented leadership and meritorious service. It had just been compared to a cheap plastic trophy and dismissed as a nice little ribbon. It was no longer a symbol of my sacrifice. It was a toy, a trinket. An insignificant little thing that couldn't possibly compare to the glories of the Greenwich Country Club. The taste of turkey and gravy turned to ash in my mouth. That night, sleep was impossible. The laughter from the dinner table echoed in my ears. I lay in my childhood bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the familiar, crushing weight of loneliness. Desperate for a lifeline, for just one person to understand, I called my mother. I hoped to find some comfort, a small piece of solidarity. Mom, why is he like that? Why does he always do that? I asked, my voice cracking as I fought to hold back a sob. There was a long, weary sigh on the other end of the line. It was a sound I knew well. It was the sound of surrender. Oh, Sienna, you know your father, she said, her voice placating, tired. He just worries about you. He just wants to see you settled. You know, a good husband, a life close to home. This career of yours, it's all just so foreign to him. He doesn't understand it. The word settled landed like a prison sentence. It meant giving up who I was. It meant abandoning the career, the life, the identity I'd fought tooth and nail to build for myself. It meant becoming a person they could understand, a person they could control. And my mother wasn't defending me. She wasn't standing with me. She was standing on the side of peace and quiet, on the side of not rocking the boat. And in that battle, I was completely on my own. If you've ever felt like you had to fight your battles completely alone, even within your own family, support this story with a like, and just type the word alone in the comments so I know I'm not the only one. I hung up the phone without another word and walked to the window. Outside, thick, silent snowflakes were blanketing the perfectly manicured lawns of Greenwich. It was beautiful, serene, and felt as cold and remote as my own heart. And in that moment, staring out at the falling snow, a painful truth finally crystallized inside me. I would never, ever get the approval I so desperately craved from them. Seeking it was as pointless as trying to find warmth from a statue of ice. Something inside me died that night. It was the little girl who had always looked for a pat on the head from her father, the young woman who had hoped that one day one of her accomplishments would finally be enough. She was gone. But in her place, something else was born. Something harder, colder, and infinitely stronger, a resolve of pure, unyielding steel. If they couldn't see my worth, then I would build a life so full of it that they wouldn't be able to ignore it. I was done fighting for their acceptance. From now on, I was fighting for me. The day my parents dropped me off at the gates of the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, is etched into my memory. It wasn't a warm, tearful goodbye. My father didn't hug me. He offered his hand, and his grip was firm, brief, and cold as stone. "Don't embarrass us, Sienna," he said, his voice low and final. My mother cried, but they weren't the tears of a mother heartbroken to be leaving her daughter. They were the thin, anxious tears of a woman worried about what the neighbors back in Greenwich would say. Then the sleek, black sedan pulled away from the curb, leaving me standing alone on the historic grounds with my single, olive-drab duffel bag at my feet. A profound, chilling loneliness washed over me. I was an island. Before I even had a moment to process it, a towering upperclassman with a jawline that looked like it was carved from granite got an inch from my face. "Move it, plebe!" he screamed, his voice like a thunderclap. There was no time for sadness. There was no transition. My old life was over. My war had begun. They call the first year at the academy plebe year, and it is, in every sense of the word, hell on earth. It was a systematic dismantling of everything I thought I was. We were woken up at 5 a.m. by bells and screaming. Every single day was a brutal, relentless assault on our physical and mental limits. We ran until our lungs burned, did push-ups until our arms gave out, and navigated obstacle courses that left us bruised and caked in mud. Shouting was the primary form of communication. We were taught to be invisible, to speak only when spoken to, and to move with a speed and purpose I never knew I possessed. Every part of me ached, all the time. My muscles were in a constant state of screaming protest. I was perpetually exhausted, running on a cocktail of caffeine and sheer, stubborn will. I learned to eat a full meal in 5 minutes, to sleep in any spare moment I could find, and to iron my uniform with such precision that you could cut yourself on the creases. It was a world designed to break you, to strip away your identity and rebuild you as part of a machine. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of training in the muddy, rain-soaked fields, I dragged my exhausted body back to my dorm room. I was covered in grime, my muscles felt like shredded meat, and all I wanted was to collapse onto my perfectly made bed. The phone rang. It was my mother. For a fleeting, foolish second, my heart lifted. I pictured a few words of encouragement, a simple, "How are you holding up, honey?" Instead, her voice was bubbly, impossibly cheerful, like she was calling from another planet. "Sienna, darling, I have the most wonderful news," she chirped. "Daniel just graduated from Yale, and your father is rewarding him with a 2-month tour of Europe. Isn't that just marvelous? Your brother is so brilliant." I stood there in the middle of my stark, sterile room, my boots leaving muddy prints on the floor, my body aching with a fatigue that went bone deep, and I listened. I listened to her talk about the 5-star hotels in Paris, the art museums in Florence, the lavish parties Daniel would be attending. She never once asked if I was okay. She never asked how my day was. In that moment, the injustice of it all felt like a cold, heavy stone lodging itself in my throat. Our paths, our sacrifices, were so grotesquely different they couldn't even be compared. He was being rewarded for existing, for following the path they had laid out for him. I had to fight every single day just to prove I deserved to be here. There was a night, a few weeks later, when I almost broke. During a late-night drill in a freezing, relentless downpour, I made a small mistake on the obstacle course. As punishment, my entire platoon had to do push-ups in the mud until the instructor got tired of watching us suffer. The weight of their exhaustion, of their misery, felt like it was all my fault. Guilt pressed down on me, heavier than my waterlogged gear. When I finally got back to my room, I was soaked through, shivering uncontrollably. I caught my reflection in the small mirror over my desk. I saw a ghost staring back at me, with hollow eyes and rain and tears streaking down her face. A voice whispered in my head, and it sounded terrifyingly like my father's. "What the hell are you doing here? You don't belong here." I sank onto the edge of my bed and let the sobs come, silent, racking shudders of despair. I thought about quitting. I thought about calling them and admitting he was right all along. But then, my eyes landed on the small American flag tacked to the wall above my desk, and I remembered why I'd started this journey in the first place. I wasn't just running toward a career, I was running away from their shadow. I was here to build something that was entirely my own, something they couldn't touch, couldn't control, and couldn't diminish with their casual cruelty. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and pushed myself to my feet. I clenched my fists until my knuckles turned white. They would not win. Their contempt would not be the thing that defined me. It was in that moment of deepest isolation that a small ray of light appeared. It came in a plain white envelope, tucked into my mailbox. It was a letter from a man named Dave Miller. He was a few years older than me, a prior enlisted sailor who had come to the academy after years of experience in the fleet. We had met briefly during a summer training exercise. His letter wasn't fancy. There were no flowery words. It was just a few simple lines written in a strong, steady hand. It said, "Sienna, plebe year is always the hardest. Don't let the bastards get you down. I saw you on the course this summer. You have what it takes to be a leader. Keep pushing. That was it. Just a few simple sentences. But those words carried more weight, more genuine validation than every hollow compliment I had ever received from my family. It was recognition from a peer, from a fellow warrior who understood the fight. That simple, handwritten note became my talisman. I read it until I had it memorized. It was a promise that I wasn't entirely alone. It was a reminder that out there, beyond the gilded cage of Greenwich, another kind of family was waiting for me. A family forged not in blood, but in shared struggle and mutual respect. Master Chief Petty Officer David "Dave" Miller was unlike anyone I had ever known. He was what the Navy calls a plank owner, a salt-of-the-earth sailor who had been with a ship since its commissioning. He had a face like a weathered map, etched with lines that told stories of deployments I could only read about, and eyes that had seen far too much. When I first took command as a young, green-as-grass major, he was tough on me. He was formal, exacting, and watched my every move with a critical eye. But I soon realized that beneath the gruff, old-school exterior was a fierce, protective loyalty and a genuine desire to see me succeed. He never offered me empty praise. Instead, he would pull me aside after a briefing and point out my mistakes with a bluntness that was both jarring and incredibly valuable. "Major," he told me once, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Your decision was sound, but your delivery was hesitant. Your people need certainty from their commander, not an apology." Coming from him, that advice was worth more than any degree. He didn't care that I was a woman or that I was years younger than him. He cared about competence. He was teaching me how to lead not by rank, but by earning respect. That respect became a lifeline one year when I pulled duty over Thanksgiving. I was stationed at Naval Station Norfolk in Virginia, and the holiday fell right in the middle of a critical readiness inspection. Going home was out of the question. I made the obligatory call back to Greenwich. My mother answered, and after I explained I wouldn't be there, she just sighed and said, "Oh, what a shame. The family will miss you." Then, without missing a beat, her voice brightened as she quickly changed the subject. "Daniel is having the most wonderful time, by the way. He's on a ski trip in Aspen with his friends from the firm." I hung up the phone, a familiar hollow ache spreading through my chest. I stared at the sterile, gray walls of my office on the base. I imagined them in Greenwich, the warm glow of the fireplace, the clinking of wine glasses, and I felt a million miles away. I resigned myself to a quiet, lonely holiday. My Thanksgiving dinner, I figured, would be a Salisbury steak from a frozen meal tray, heated up in the break room microwave. That evening, I was finishing up some paperwork when one of my junior officers poked his head in. "Major, Master Chief Miller needs you in the common room for a minute." Wearily, I pushed my chair back and headed down the hall, expecting some last-minute issue with the inspection schedule. But when I pushed open the door to the common room, the lights flipped on. Surprise! The entire room was filled with my unit. At least 30 sailors, all of them smiling, were packed into the space. The long tables were covered in plastic tablecloths and laden with food. Dave Miller stood in the center of it all, a huge grin on his face. Beside him was his wife, Mary, a warm, kind woman with laughter in her eyes, holding a massive roasting pan. The incredible mouth-watering scent of roast turkey, gravy, and sage filled the air. There was a mountain of creamy mashed potatoes, green bean casserole with crispy onions on top, and a bowl of rich, homemade cranberry sauce. Mary bustled over and wrapped me in a tight, motherly hug. She smelled like cinnamon and vanilla. "No one should be alone on Thanksgiving, honey," she whispered in my ear. I was speechless. A lump formed in my throat, so thick I couldn't swallow. We all squeezed around the tables, a motley crew of sailors far from home, passing plates and sharing stories and laughing. There was no judgment in that room, no comparisons. No one was trying to impress anyone. It was just easy. It was warm. After we'd all eaten until we were stuffed, Dave stood up, tapping his glass of sparkling cider with a fork. The room quieted down. "I'd like to make a toast," he said, his deep voice commanding the room. He turned his eyes to me. "To Major Barber." He looked directly at me, his expression serious and full of a respect my father had never once shown me. "She may be young," he continued, his voice ringing with conviction. But she is one of the finest, sharpest, and bravest officers I have ever had the honor of serving under. We are all proud to call her our commander. The room erupted in a chorus of hoo-yahs and applause. And in that moment, I cried. The walls I had so carefully built around my heart just crumbled. They weren't tears of sadness or self-pity. They were tears of overwhelming, bone-deep gratitude. For the first time in my life, I felt like I truly belonged somewhere. This was family. This chaotic, loud, loving group of people. They didn't value me for who I was trying to be, or for what I could do for their reputation. They respected me for who I was. The party wound down in a comfortable, happy haze. As I was helping Mary pack up the leftovers, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. The name on the screen made the warmth in my chest instantly turn to ice. Richard Barber. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. A part of me wanted to just ignore it, to preserve the perfect peace of the evening. But I knew that would only delay the inevitable. I took a deep breath and answered. I didn't even get a hello. His voice was cold, clipped, and laced with irritation. Sienna, he commanded, I need you at the house next weekend. We're hosting an important fundraiser for the senator. And you need to be here to present a united family front. And for God's sake, wear a proper dress, not one of your soldier outfits. Just like that, the warmth of the evening was gone, extinguished as if a switch had been flipped. The cozy feeling of belonging evaporated, replaced by the familiar, chilling dread. The shadow of my family was always there, lurking, waiting to pull me back into the cold. I knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in my stomach, that another confrontation was unavoidable. Against my better judgment, I made the mistake of going home for that fundraiser. I told myself it was to keep the peace, but a small, naive part of me still held out a sliver of hope that things might be different. I wore a simple, elegant black dress, something conservative and unassuming. My goal was to blend in, to be a ghost on the wall of their opulent Greenwich home. But my father, of course, had other plans. The house was overflowing with the powerful and the influential. Men in expensive suits and women dripping with diamonds mingled under the light of crystal chandeliers, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. My father was in his element, a master puppeteer pulling the strings of his social universe. He spotted me across the room, and his eyes lit up, not with fatherly affection, but with the gleam of a man who has just found his most interesting new toy. He strode over, grabbing my elbow in a grip that was surprisingly strong. Sienna, perfect. There's someone I want you to meet. He steered me through the crowd towards Senator Thompson, a man whose political career my father had been heavily investing in. Senator, my father said, his voice booming with false, practiced pride, I'd like you to meet my little girl, Sienna. He paused for dramatic effect, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. She's an officer in the Navy, our brave little soldier. I went numb. Little soldier? The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. In one breath, he had infantilized me and reduced my entire career, my sacrifices, my leadership, my very identity, into a charming little anecdote, a party trick to impress a politician. I wasn't his daughter. I was a novelty item, a piece of decor. The senator gave me a patronizing pat on the arm. How admirable, young lady, he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. The country is proud of you. His praise felt hollow, meaningless, because it was filtered through my father's demeaning introduction. I just stood there, a polite smile frozen on my face, while inside, a cold, hard knot of rage began to form in my stomach. A few weeks later, my fiancé, Mark, and I officially announced our engagement. My father's reaction was immediate and absolute. He summoned us to his study, a room paneled in dark mahogany that always smelled of leather and money. He didn't congratulate us. He began issuing directives. The wedding will be held at the Greenwich Country Club, he declared, leaning back in his oversized leather chair. I've already put a deposit down. The guest list will be 500 people. Our most important business and political contacts will be there. Sienna, your mother has already selected a designer for your dress. And Mark, he said, turning his cold eyes on my fiancé. "You'll need to get a haircut. Something more respectable." He wasn't asking. He was informing us of a series of non-negotiable business decisions. My wedding, our special day, had been hijacked and rebranded as a corporate networking event. Everything was about appearances, about projecting an image of wealth and power. I tried to protest. "Dad, wait," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Mark and we were hoping for something smaller, something more personal and meaningful." He waved his hand, dismissing my words as if they were a gnat buzzing in the air. "Don't be ridiculous, Sienna," he said with a sigh of exasperation. "This is how things are done in our world. It's time you remembered that." The tension simmered for days, a low-grade fever of resentment. Then, my brother Daniel decided to pour gasoline on the fire. He called me one afternoon, his voice dripping with the casual, condescending amusement he had perfected over a lifetime of being the golden child. "So, I hear you're causing a little trouble with the wedding plans," he began, a sneer in his voice. "What do you think you are, General MacArthur? This is a respectable family, Sienna, not a boot camp. Just do what Dad says and make it easy on everyone. Don't turn this into some kind of circus with your silly little uniforms." Circus! The word hit me like a physical slap. He saw my world, the world of honor, courage, and commitment that I had dedicated my life to, as a joke, a sideshow. His contempt, in some ways, was even more painful than my father's authoritarianism. It came from someone of my own generation, someone who should have known better, but who had chosen to blindly adopt the same toxic values. I felt a hot surge of anger course through my veins, so intense it made my hands tremble. But the final breaking blow came, as it so often did, from my mother. She called me later that night, her voice hushed and pleading. "Sienna, please," she whispered into the phone. "Please don't make your father angry. You know he loves you, he just has a difficult way of showing it. Can't you just give in a little? For the sake of family harmony." Harmony? The word shot out of me, louder and sharper than I intended. "You call this harmony?" "Mom, what you call harmony is silence. It's submission. It's letting him walk all over us and pretending it's okay." The silence on the other end of the line was her answer. It was a silence filled with years of capitulation, of choosing the easy path over the right one. And in that silence, I finally, truly understood. They were never going to change. They would spend the rest of their lives trying to cram me into a box I didn't fit in, a box that would suffocate me. A strange, cold calm washed over me. The trembling stopped. The hot rage cooled into something solid and clear. I took a deep breath. "I'm sorry, Mom," I said, and my voice was perfectly steady, without a trace of the storm that had been raging inside me. "But I'm not going to do that." And I hung up the phone. The soft click as the call disconnected was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a lock breaking. It was the sound of a chain snapping. The water had reached the top of the dam, and now it had finally, irrevocably, spilled over. The game was over. The true explosion, the one that incinerated every last shred of daughterly duty left in my soul, arrived not as a shout, but as a quiet, chillingly professional email. It landed in my inbox a day after I hung up on my mother. The subject line was cold and corporate. Regarding wedding arrangements. It was from my father. And he had carbon copied the family's attorney. I opened it, my heart beginning to pound a hard, frantic rhythm against my ribs. The body of the email was not a message from a father to a daughter. It was a list of directives, formatted like a legal document. The venue, the guest list, the attire, even the approved menu choices. It was a declaration of ownership over my life. And then I saw the final paragraph. The words were so cold, so transactional, they seemed to burn through the screen. "Compliance with these reasonable requests will be considered a demonstration of your respect for this family," he had written. "Any deviation from this plan may force me to reconsider future financial support and inheritance provisions." That was it. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't an olive branch. It was a threat, a piece of black and white blackmail. He was using money, the only language he truly understood, to buy my obedience. He was putting a price tag on my silence. He was telling me that my place in this family was not a birthright, but a contract I had to sign with my submission. I threw my phone onto the bed as if it were on fire. My hands were shaking, not with fear, but with a rage so pure and white-hot it felt like it was going to consume me. Mark walked into the room, took one look at my face, and was by my side in an instant, his arms wrapping around me. "Sienna, what is it? What happened?" I couldn't speak. I just pointed a trembling finger at the phone. He picked it up, his eyes scanning the email. I watched his face change. His jaw tightened and a muscle feathered along his cheek. When he finished, he put the phone down gently, his eyes filled with a dark, protective fire I had never seen before. "That son of a bitch," he whispered, the words a low, dangerous growl. He pulled me closer. "I am so sorry you have to deal with this, my love." I pulled back, shaking my head, looking up at him with tears of fury spilling down my cheeks. "No," I said, my voice raw and cracking. "No, I'm not dealing with this anymore. I'm done, Mark. I am done. I have spent my entire life trying to be the person they wanted me to be, trying to win a game that was rigged from the start, and it was never enough. I'm finished." He looked deep into my eyes, his own gaze unwavering and solid as bedrock. "So what are we going to do, worries?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. He said, "We." And in that one word, I felt the strength of 1,000 armies. "We," I said, a fierce wild resolve hardening my voice, "are going to fight." That night, after Mark had fallen asleep, I couldn't rest. I walked into our spare room and took out my service dress white uniform. I put it on, piece by piece, the familiar ritual a calming balm on my raging thoughts. I stood in front of the full-length mirror and looked at my reflection. I didn't see a little soldier or a disobedient daughter. I saw a major in the United States Navy. My eyes traced the colorful ribbons on my chest. Each one told a story. The Navy Commendation Medal from that Christmas Eve. A ribbon for service in the Persian Gulf. A unit citation for a mission where my intelligence analysis saved lives. These weren't trinkets. They were covenants, earned with sweat and sleepless nights and the sacred trust of the men and women I led. I was forged in the crucible of Annapolis. I had faced down threats in hostile waters. I had commanded hundreds of sailors who would trust me with their lives. So why in God's name was I letting two men in a mansion in Connecticut dictate my worth? A new kind of anger rose within me. It wasn't the hot, chaotic rage from before. It was a clean, cold fire, a focused, strategic fury. The kind of anger that gets things done. I slowly raised my hand and placed my fingertips on the silver oak leaf insignia on my collar. "Never again," I swore to the woman in the mirror, my voice a low, unbreakable vow. "I will never let them make me feel small again." I walked over to my desk and opened my laptop. The emotional storm had passed. Now, the battlefield was clear. The objective was defined. I felt the familiar click in my brain, the shift from emotional reaction to strategic planning, the same way I felt when analyzing intelligence for a high-stakes mission. I wasn't going to cancel the wedding. Canceling was retreating. I was going to turn their battlefield into my stage. My father's party, my father's guests, my father's country club. But it would be my rules, my terms of engagement. If you have ever reached that breaking point, that moment where you knew you could no longer stay silent, support this story with a like and just type the words "no more" in the comments below. I started a new email. My fingers flew across the keyboard, no longer trembling. The first recipient, my commanding officer. The second, Master Chief Petty Officer Dave Miller. The subject line was simple: a special request. They wanted a show. In the days that followed, our small apartment in Charleston transformed. The cozy living room, once a place for quiet evenings with books and shared cups of tea, became a makeshift command center. The emotional storm had passed, leaving behind a cold, clear, and focused calm. The anger was still there, but it was no longer a wildfire. It was a controlled burn, a fuel source I could channel. Mark, my steadfast, incredible Mark, was my second in command. We spread a blueprint of St. Michael's Chapel and a floor plan of the reception hall across our dining room table. It felt as familiar and as focused as any pre-mission briefing I had ever led. "All right," I said, tapping a point on the chapel diagram. "Phase 1 is seating. My father will have his guests, his investors, his political allies, his entire world, seated in the first 10 rows on the right side of the aisle." The groom's side. "And the bride's side?" Mark asked, a small determined smile playing on his lips. "The bride's side," I confirmed, "will be a sea of white and blue. We'll reserve the first 10 rows on the left exclusively for military personnel. It creates a clear visual divide, two opposing forces." Mark nodded, already taking notes on a legal pad. "I'll coordinate with the wedding planner. I'll tell her it's a military tradition. She won't question it. What about the honor guard?" My finger moved to a small antechamber near the main entrance on the blueprint. "They'll muster here, out of sight. They don't move until the right moment. This isn't just about presence, it's about timing and psychological impact. They are the reveal." This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about strategy. It was about taking the skills the Navy had taught me: analysis, planning, precision, and using them to win the most important battle of my life. For the linchpin of the plan, I knew I needed someone I could trust implicitly, someone who understood command, respect, and loyalty, not as abstract concepts, but as a way of life. I needed Dave Miller. I called him on a video chat that evening. He answered from his living room, looking relaxed in a worn-out Navy PT shirt. In the background, I could see his little girl, a whirlwind of pink and pigtails, chasing their golden retriever around the couch. It was a picture of the warm, normal family life I craved. I didn't waste time with emotional explanations or a long, rambling story of my family's cruelty. I knew he wouldn't need it. I spoke to him as his commanding officer, laying out the operational details with concise, professional language. "Master Chief," I began, "I have an off-the-books request. I need an honor guard of 6 sailors for my wedding ceremony, and I need you to be the one to call the command. This is an unofficial detail, but it is of the utmost importance to me personally." He watched me through the screen, his weathered face impassive, his eyes holding a depth of understanding that was unnerving. He didn't ask, why? He didn't ask if I was okay. He just listened. When I was finished, he was silent for a long moment, the only sound being the faint laughter of his daughter in the background. Then he looked directly into the camera, and his voice was as firm and steady as an anchor chain. "Major," he said, "we'll be there. We always have our commander's back. You just give us the time and the place." Tears pricked my eyes, but I blinked them back. This was what true loyalty looked like. This was the unwavering support my family, with all their money and influence, could never comprehend. "Thank you, Dave," I whispered. "Thank you." The next phase of the operation was assembling the troops. Over the following days, I sent out carefully worded, subtly coded invitations to my closest and most trusted colleagues from every stage of my career. The message didn't speak of a confrontation. It didn't hint at the drama. It simply said, "Your presence in your service dress whites would be the most meaningful wedding gift Mark and I could ever ask for." The responses were immediate and overwhelming. "Consider it done, Major. Happy to be there for you. For you, anything." One by one, the confirmations rolled in. Lieutenants, commanders, enlisted sailors, and fellow officers I had served with from Norfolk to the Persian Gulf. Nearly 150 men and women confirmed they would be there. They weren't just coming to a wedding. They understood the subtext. They were coming to stand in solidarity. Each yes was another brick in the fortress wall being built around me. My father had his money and his power brokers. I had an army. The hours leading up to the ceremony were a blur of surreal calm. I was in the bridal suite of the chapel, a beautiful sunlit room with antique furniture. My service dress white uniform was hanging pristine and ready, the gold buttons gleaming. As predicted, the final volley of psychological warfare from my family arrived via text. A message from my father. I trust you won't make a spectacle of yourself with that ridiculous costume. Followed by one from Daniel. Don't embarrass us in front of the senator. Try to look like a normal person for once. I read the messages, and for the first time, they had no power. They didn't sting. They didn't even register as an insult. They were just noise. Static from a distant, irrelevant world. I had a plan. I had my allies. I was no longer the little girl starving for a crumb of their approval. I was a commander about to step onto a battlefield of my own choosing. I carefully pinned my last ribbon, the Navy Commendation Medal, onto my chest. I took a long, slow, deep breath, centering myself. And from outside the thick wooden doors of the suite, I heard the first, deep, resonant notes of the organ begin to play. It was time. The stage was set. The heavy oak doors swung open, and I stepped across the threshold. The scene before me was exactly as I had designed it, a battlefield, drawn with perfect clarity. To my right was my father's world, a glittering sea of expensive suits, silk dresses, and perfectly coiffed hair. The air on that side of the aisle hummed with the low murmur of money and influence, a chorus of whispered comments and self-satisfied smiles. To my left was my world, a silent, disciplined ocean of service dress whites and blues, straight backs, steady gazes, and a profound collective stillness that seemed to absorb the very sound from the air. The two worlds sat facing each other, separated by the white rose petals scattered on the stone floor, an invisible line of demarcation drawn down the center of the chapel. I saw my father in the front row. He caught my eye and gave me a condescending smirk, a final, silent dismissal. He still didn't get it. He looked at the 150 service members on my side and saw nothing but props for my little act of rebellion. A spectacle that would only make me look more ridiculous in his world. He couldn't understand that they weren't guests. They were living, breathing evidence of a life he refused to see. They were my truth. The organ swelled, and I began my walk. Each step was measured, deliberate, my heels clicking with a steady rhythm on the cool stone. I felt the weight of every eye in the chapel on me, the civilian side buzzing with confused whispers, the military side locked in a silent, powerful vigil. As I drew level with the front pew, I heard it, just as I knew I would. The low, venomous whisper from my father to my brother. Look at her. A Halloween costume at her own wedding. What an embarrassment. And then, Daniel's quiet, dismissive snort of laughter. This time, the words didn't pierce me. They didn't even scratch the surface. This time, they were nothing but fuel. I kept my chin high, my gaze locked on Mark, who stood waiting for me at the altar, his eyes a beacon of unwavering love and support in the storm. This was it, the moment of ignition. When I reached the halfway point down the aisle, the designated point on our battle map, the plan was set into motion. Master Chief Dave Miller, seated in the first row on my left, rose to his feet. He didn't just stand up. It was a single, explosive motion. A spring-loaded release of energy that was both silent and deafening. Every head in the chapel snapped towards him. The low hum of chatter from my father's side died instantly. A complete, absolute silence fell over the room, so thick you could feel it pressing in on you. And into that perfect vacuum-sealed silence, Dave Miller's voice erupted. It was not a yell. It was a command, a voice forged on the noisy decks of aircraft carriers and honed in the chaos of combat. A voice that cut through the air with the force of a shockwave. Ladies and gentlemen, Major Barber is present. The reaction was instantaneous. It wasn't a series of individual movements. It was a single, unified, biological response. A tidal wave of white and blue. 150 service members shot to their feet as one. The sound of 300 military dress shoes hitting the stone floor at the exact same millisecond was not a noise. It was a physical event. A single, sharp, percussive crack that sounded like a rifle shot, echoing off the stone walls and high vaulted ceiling. It was the thunderclap of disciplined respect. In the ringing silence that followed, dozens of hands snapped up in perfect, crisp salutes. a silent forest of white-gloved hands held rigid, a testament to an honor my father's world could not comprehend. My father's empire shattered in that moment. His guests were frozen, their faces a gallery of slack-jawed, wide-eyed disbelief. The senator, the man he was so desperate to impress, looked utterly stunned. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her face drained of all color. The smug smirk on Daniel's face evaporated, replaced by a mask of pure, uncomprehending confusion. But my eyes, my focus, were locked on one person. My father. His face was a masterpiece of collapse. I watched, in what felt like slow motion, as the layers of his arrogance were stripped away. The condescending smirk vanished first, replaced by disbelief. Disbelief melted into shock. Shock curdled into a dawning, horrified realization. And finally, all that was left was the raw, naked awareness of his own defeat. He wasn't looking at his little soldier playing dress-up anymore. He was looking at a commander. He was a witness to a form of power his money could not buy, his influence could not command, and his mind could not process. For the first time in my life, my father, Richard Barber, the titan of investment banking, looked small. He just sat there, pinned to his seat by the sheer weight of the respect his daughter had earned, a respect he had never once offered her. He sat there, silenced, defeated not by an argument or a shout, but by a truth so powerful it needed no words. I reached the altar and took Mark's hand. His grip was firm, his eyes shining with pride. The battle was over. I had won. And as I turned to face the minister, the chapel was still wrapped in a blanket of stunned, absolute silence. The ceremony ended, but the silence lingered. It followed us from the chapel to the reception hall at the country club, a thick, heavy blanket of astonishment that muted the celebratory music and the clinking of glasses. The high adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, leaving behind a strange, hollow ringing in my ears. I felt a profound sense of relief, but it was quickly followed by an exhaustion so deep it felt like it was in my bones. The large, opulent ballroom was, just as the chapel had been, a room divided. It was like looking at two different countries separated by an invisible, heavily guarded border. On one side, my world, my chosen family. My brothers and sisters in arms, along with Mark's family and friends, had created an island of warmth and laughter. They shared stories of deployments, inside jokes from the academy, and teased Mark mercilessly about marrying an officer. For the first time in my life, at a family event, I felt like I was in the center of the warmth, not standing outside in the cold, looking in. The sound of their genuine joy was the sweetest music I had ever heard. And on the other side of the room, clustered together in a tight, isolated huddle, was my father's world. He, my mother, Daniel, and their most important guests looked like shipwreck survivors clinging to a piece of driftwood. Their expensive clothes and glittering jewelry suddenly looked gaudy and meaningless against the backdrop of the crisp, honorable uniforms on our side. Their power, which had always been so absolute in these settings, had simply evaporated. No one approached their island. They were ostracized, not by force, but by the sheer, undeniable weight of what they had just witnessed. I was talking with Master Chief Miller, thanking him with a voice thick with emotion when I saw my father approaching. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning. The usual arrogant posture was gone, replaced by a slump in his shoulders. The mask of confident authority had been replaced by a raw, bewildered hurt. He didn't look at me directly. He stared at a point just over my shoulder, as if looking me in the eye was a task too great for him. "Why?" he asked, his voice a hoarse, broken whisper. It wasn't a question seeking understanding. It was an accusation. "Why would you embarrass me like that in front of everyone?" I took a slow, deep breath, and a strange calm settled over me. The anger was gone. The hurt was gone. All that was left was a vast, quiet sadness for the man he was, for the father he could never be. "I didn't embarrass you, Dad," I replied, my voice gentle, but firm. "I was just myself, maybe for the very first time in front of you. And I'm not going to apologize for that anymore." He finally looked at me then, truly looked at me. But there was no flicker of recognition in his eyes, no dawning comprehension. There was only the blank, uncomprehending stare of a stranger. He didn't say another word. He just turned, his shoulders stooped, and walked away. A few minutes later, I saw them leave. My mother and Daniel, one on each side of my father, essentially supporting him as they guided him out a side exit, avoiding the main foyer. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't wave. They simply vanished. And their departure didn't leave a void. Instead, it felt like a pressure had been released. The room suddenly seemed brighter, the music clearer, the laughter louder. I realized then that our relationship had been like an aching, infected tooth for years, a source of constant low-grade pain that I had just learned to live with. And today, I had finally pulled it. The process had been brutal, excruciatingly painful, but the relief that followed was real, clean, and absolute. Mark came to my side and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. I nodded, feeling a single, warm tear escape and trace a path down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or of anger. It was a tear of release. "I'm okay," I said, my voice barely a whisper. For the first time in a very long time, I am really, truly okay. Later that night, back in the quiet of our hotel suite overlooking the city, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a long text message from my mother. It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive guilt, a long, rambling paragraph filled with phrases like, "After all we've done for you," and "Your father is devastated," and ending with a desperate plea for me to think about what you've done to this family. I read the words and felt the familiar, weary exhaustion begin to creep back in. The endless cycle of blame, of manipulation, of making me responsible for their feelings. But this time, something was different. I didn't feel the urge to defend myself. I didn't feel the need to argue. I didn't feel anything but a quiet, final resolve. Without hesitating, I opened my contacts. I found my mother's name and tapped block. I did the same for my father, and then for Daniel. It wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of self-preservation. It was the final, necessary step. The door, which had been left cracked open for a lifetime, was now closed and locked. I stood by the window, looking out at the glittering lights of Charleston spread out below. A chapter of my life, a long, painful chapter defined by their shadow, had just ended. And a new one, a chapter whose words I'd yet to write, whose story would be entirely my own, was just about to begin. 5 years. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, other times the blink of an eye. 5 years since that day in the chapel in Charleston. I am Lieutenant Commander Sienna Barber Davis now, in command of an intelligence squadron based out of San Diego, California. The heavy, humid air of the East Coast has been replaced by the dry, sun-baked warmth of the Pacific. Mark and I have a 4-year-old daughter, a bright, fierce little girl with my eyes and a stubborn chin. Her name is Eleanor. We live in a small, unassuming house in a quiet neighborhood where the sound of kids playing on the street is more common than the roar of expensive sports cars. Our life isn't always easy. There are long deployments, sleepless nights spent worrying, the constant juggle of 2 demanding careers and a child. But it is ours. It is a life built on a foundation of respect, partnership, and open conversation. Our home is filled with laughter, the smell of Mark's questionable attempts at baking, and the beautiful, chaotic mess of a life being truly lived. I no longer have any contact with my biological family. The blocked numbers remain blocked. Sometimes, usually in the quiet moments late at night, a ghost of a feeling will surface. A flicker of sadness. A fleeting ache for what could have been. For the family you see in holiday movies. But it passes as quickly as it comes, always replaced by an overwhelming wave of gratitude for the profound, unshakable peace I fought so hard to win. My definition of family has been completely rewritten. It's a definition forged in choice, not obligation. Family is Dave and Mary Miller, who fly out from Virginia twice a year and insist our daughter call them Grandpa Dave and Grandma Mary. Family is the handful of squadron mates who crowd into our small living room for Thanksgiving and Christmas, bringing side dishes and bad jokes, creating a warm, boisterous home for those of us who can't be with the ones we left behind. It's our next-door neighbors, a retired Marine and his wife, who watch Eleanor at a moment's notice whenever one of us gets an unexpected duty call. These are the people connected to me, not by blood, but by something far stronger. Choice. They choose to be in our lives, and we choose them. Their love is unconditional, free of the silent, crushing weight of expectation and judgment. One afternoon, I was in my office, conducting a standard performance review with a young ensign, fresh out of the academy. She was brilliant, dedicated, one of the sharpest young officers I'd seen, but she always carried a shadow of anxiety in her eyes. As we wrapped up the official business, she hesitated. "Ma'am," she began, her voice quiet, "can I ask you something personal?" I nodded. "My family. They don't get this life. They think I'm wasting my education. They want me to do something safer, more normal. I don't know how to make them understand." I looked at her, and in her worried face, I saw a reflection of myself from a decade ago. The same hunger for approval, the same fear of disappointing the people who were supposed to be your biggest supporters. I smiled, a genuine, gentle smile. "Let me tell you a story," I said. I didn't tell her everything. I didn't tell her about the wedding, or the Christmas dinner, or the cold transactional emails. She didn't need the bitter details. She needed the lesson. "Your worth," I told her, my voice soft but sure, "is not determined by anyone else's approval, not even your family's. It is determined by your actions, by your integrity, and by the respect you earn from the people who stand beside you when it matters. Never, ever let anyone convince you otherwise." I watched a small brave light turn on in her eyes, and I knew she understood. That morning, I woke before the sun. I slipped out of bed, leaving Mark and Eleanor sleeping peacefully, and drove to Coronado Beach. I walked along the shore, the cool, damp sand beneath my bare feet. I watched as the sun began its slow ascent over the horizon, painting the dark Pacific sky with strokes of soft pink and fiery orange. I stood there, breathing in the clean, salt-tinged air, and thought about the word legacy. For most of my life, I believed legacy was what my father would leave behind. A name on a building, a portfolio of stocks, a reputation built on power and control. But I was wrong. Legacy wasn't something you left behind. It was something you lived right now. Legacy was the sound of my daughter's laughter echoing in our small house. It was the unwavering trust in my husband's eyes. It was the quiet pride I felt seeing a young officer stand a little taller, a little stronger, because of a lesson I had shared. Legacy was this moment. This peace in my soul. This love I had built from the ground up. This strength to stand on the edge of the continent, look out at the endless ocean, and say, "This is me." And as the first warm rays of the new day touched my face, I knew, with a certainty that filled every part of my being, that I was finally, completely, and irrevocably free. And that is my story. It was a difficult journey, but it taught me that true freedom isn't the absence of scars. It's building a life you love around them. We all have the power to break cycles, define our own families, and choose our own legacy. I'd be honored to hear what that word means to you. Please share just one word in the comments that represents the legacy you are building. Your stories make this community powerful. If my journey resonated with you, please like and subscribe to support the channel so we can continue sharing stories of resilience together.